we're good to go? Are we live on Zoom and all? Okay. Oh, very exciting. Hello and good evening, and welcome to the 2022 Milton and Freddie Kronsberg Memorial Lecture. I'm Ilana Kaufman, Director of the Yaschik Arnold Jewish Studies Program and Associate Professor of Jewish and Middle Eastern Studies here at the College of Charleston. Before I introduce our guest tonight, just a few reminders. The Jewish Studies program offers a broad range of events for our students and the community, and there's still two remaining ones after tonight's. One, this Thursday at 5 p.m., we will hold a conversation with Anastasia Strachova, a Ukrainian doctoral candidate from Kharkiv, who is currently at Emory University, and she will talk to us about the situation in Ukraine. This is a Zoom-only event. Then on Sunday, we're holding the inaugural Arnold Nemiro Lecture in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. This will be on the topic of music during the Holocaust with Professor Terrell Dobbs of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. That's this Sunday, the 24th at 10 a.m. And as many of you know, there's the usual delicious brunch served from 9 a.m. for those who bother to show up in person. It's worth it. So information on these events and everything else that we do can be found on our website at jewish.cfc.edu/events or on our Facebook page. And for those joining us on Zoom, I'm sure the links will be up there shortly. And now for tonight's event. First, allow me to thank the Kronsberg family for their ongoing years-long support of our program. Tonight's conversation would not have happened without their generosity. And I should add also with very good advice. And members of the Kronsberg family are with us tonight. So it's great to see you here, and thank you all for your support. Tonight we are extremely privileged to have with us Ilana Kaufman. Ilana is the Executive Director of the Jews of Color Iniative. Her work sits at the center of Jewish community, racial equity, and justice, and is anchored by the voices and experiences of Jews of color. The Jews of Color Iniative is focused on grant making, research, and field building, and community education. It has made significant headlines last summer with the release of its comprehensive and, I have to say, eye-opening report. It opened my eyes, at least, on Jews of color in the US, which I'm sure we'll get to discuss tonight. Ilana has previously served as the Public Affairs and Civic Engagement Director, East Bay, for the San Francisco Bay Area JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council. She's a very popular public speaker. At least that's how I see you. I hope that's okay. And we are very fortunate to have her with us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Ilana here. So just before we get going, let me just say that tonight's conversation will include a few initial questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. If you're on Zoom, feel free to type your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. I have my phone with me here, and I'm just mentioning this because that's how the questions from Zoom will get to me. I don't want any of you to think that I'm using it to check the status of my TikTok account while Ilana is answering our questions. I just want you to know that. So anyways, I think now we can get going. So perhaps we can start with just you telling us a little bit about the Jews of Color Iniative and the work that you do, and what difference do you think it makes in the lives of Jews of color and the Jewish community more broadly?
First, I just want to thank you for having me, and to thank the whole community and the family and Kim and Jesse and all the people who've made it possible. It's great to be here. The Jews of Color Iniative is finishing its 5th formal year in the Jewish community, and we were established to help respond to the question that we were getting from community leaders, specifically philanthropic Jewish community leaders, about what the experience of Jews of color is, and I think the context was really around racial unrest in the United States. And I think as really, in this case, white community leaders for the Jewish community started to maybe be in relationship with the racial injustice that was happening, particularly to Black and brown people in this country, there was this wonder, and I really think it was presented as a wonder, like, we have Black and brown people in our Jewish community. I wonder what their experience is too. And that question is what helped create energy around convening Jews of Color. I was part of a collective of about 12 really Black Jews who were brought together to help explore that question. I don't know if it was actually answer or respond to that question. And what came from that was a very clear set of needs. One is that Jews of color clearly are present in the US Jewish community, but generally underrepresented and therefore underserved. There was a set of curiosities for the community, including among Jews of color. How many are we? What are our experiences? What gets in the way if there are all these Jews of color out there, but our community generally presents as all white? What's in the middle of that? And how do we bring those edges together in a way that actually centers the experiences of Jews of color instead of just the curiosities of white Jews? And from there, we understood a set of needs. One is to bring resources to the Jewish community for Jews of color. And so we established the first fund for Jews of color field building. And as of now, the Jews of Color Initiative, over the last 4.5, 5 years, we've made, I want to guesstimate about $3 million in grants. Last year, we did $973,000 in grants to Jews of color. The second thing we do is we do research on behalf of the Jewish community. So I think we have one of the best jobs ever, which is to listen to the questions of community and then convene the smartest people we can find. And we can talk about what smart looks like in this context. But we convene the smartest people we can find to help respond to those questions and then to give us an opportunity to have narrative around the research, which is really as important as the data. And then the third thing we do is we work with influencers and community leaders to help them sit with the reality, and I'm cautious about how I say it, but to really sit with the reality of, if you look at our data, if you look at Pew's data, somewhere between 8 and 20% of the US Jewish community are people of color. And that number is getting bigger every single day. Every minute Jewish babies are born in this country, they are more hued racially than the last batch, we call them cohorts, than the last batch born yesterday. And so this isn't like a philosophical conversation about when the Jewish community will become multiracial. That train has left the station. And so our work at the Jews of Color Initiative is to help community leaders step into post-modernity, to step into the reality. And if we're gonna step into the reality that we're multiracial, we have to step into the reality that we have to be anti-racist, because we can't be racist and multiracial at the same time. I mean, we can. And what that results in is community fracturing, community fissuring, and our sort of core belief is to have an intact, thriving, robust US Jewish community. We have to see ourselves as multiracial and understand ourselves multiracial and develop deeper skills around anti-racism. And so that's our work at the Jews of Color Initiative.
Well, this is great, thanks. And it raises a bunch of questions that I would like to ask you, but first I want to get to something else, which is the big study. I just want to ask you about that. We'll get to the question of anti-racism and that kind of work because I really think it's key to what you do, but it's really one of the key questions we have to deal with in the Jewish community more broadly. But before we get to that, the question about the data itself. So I want to ask you if you can tell, you and I talked just before this about the study, and we examined it in one of my classes last semester, but I'm not sure our audience knows about it. So I wonder if you can say a few words about the study that was published last summer. What are its main conclusions? In fact, this study, as far as I can tell, this was the first time that I saw a good or at least a robust definition for who are Jews of color.
Sure.
So what does the study tell us, and how do we think of Jews of color in the US? What have largely been their experiences, if that's even something that we can discuss so broadly?
I love the question. So the Jews of Color Initiative commissioned a study that is now called Beyond the Count, and it was released in August of 2021. And it's not a representative survey. It is a snowball sampling. And so if you imagine a snowball rolling down a snow-covered hill, it starts off this big and then it collects more participants based on the physics of the connections it had before it rolled down to you. And so everybody who responded to our survey in some way found out about it from somebody else who was connected to the survey, from somebody else who was connected to the survey. But having said that, we had 1,118 respondents, which is the largest data set of Jews of color in US history, at least we can tell. And of that data set, we had 47 states and Puerto Rico represented in the data set, right? So if someone's gonna ask kind of where are Jews of color, we are everywhere. And if the Little Jews of Color Initiative and our 7 staff people can find 1,118 Jews of color, like imagine what a bigger national organization could do if they put the effort into it. The focus of the survey was both to center the experiences, beliefs, and perspectives of Jews of color based on our own terms, and we can talk about the pedagogy of the survey if you want. But this was not just about like great white colleagues wanting to know about our experiences, because the physics of a survey that centers Jews of color has to center what we want out of the survey too. And so it was about telling our stories, it was about telling our experiences, and it was focused on themes of engagement. It was focused on themes of family structure. It was focused on themes of Jewish education. It was focused on themes of experience inside Jewish community organizations. And it was focused on connection and where Jews of color feel most or least connected in our communal experiences. And some of the highlights, beyond the fact that we had over 1,000 respondents representing 47 states and Puerto Rico. First, Jews of color are highly, highly engaged in Jewish communal life. And so Jews of color are trained in and really, really focused on as a priority around Jewish ritual and Jewish experiences. Jews of color are focused on and committed to experiences of Jewish education, passing on Jewish traditions from one generation to another, honoring the Holocaust. And I want to make a little note about that as an experience. I think for Jews of color, particularly for Jews of color who come from international experiences where their family structure may have experienced genocide too, to have honoring the Holocaust be one of the top 5 priorities around things that are important to Jews of color, I think is very powerful to think about. Because it shows a capacity, for some of our families, it's directly in our family experience, but for some Jews of color, it's not directly in our family experience. And to have that be one of the top 5 important things around Jewish experiences is really important. We also learned in the survey and in the study that Jews of color experience, in addition to having all this Jewish communal life and all this Jewish communal engagement, going to camp, participating in synagogue, going to JCCs or day schools, and all of those numbers are very, very robust in the study. The other things that are also robust in the study are that Jews of color, 80% of Jews of color experience racism and discrimination in Jewish communal organizations. And so those are our spaces, right? Our synagogues, our day schools, our JCCs, our Hillels. But these are our places that we are charged with making not only welcoming, but part of these experiences are our pathways to ensuring Jewish life continues. And these are the same environments that 80% of Jews of color experience racism. One other data point that I think is really important is only 13% of Jews of color believe that Jewish communal leaders are doing an adequate job of responding to racism inside the Jewish community. What's so interesting about that is the next data point on that page is that number gets better, that number increases for how Jews of color believe Jewish communal leaders are dealing with racism outside the Jewish community. Right? And so to have the capacity to stay engaged, to be highly committed to Jewish communal life, to endure the headwinds of racism and still show up when our leaders, and I'll put myself as a communal leader in that category, are doing such an inadequate job of responding to racism is profound.
Wow. This is great, though as a descendant of Iraqi Jews, I can't say that I'm very surprised by this because some of what you just described are similar experiences to what Middle Eastern Jews had endured in Israel, especially in the state's earlier years. But you mentioned the American Jewish community, so let me ask you this. The American Jewish community is still largely dominated by white and Ashkenazi Jews, broadly speaking. And many communal leaders, they now talk the talk about diversity and racism, but they don't necessarily meaningfully engage with issues of racial equity or social justice. So I guess, what do you think should be, and you mentioned this right now at the end of your explanation about communities or people not thinking that their leaders are doing enough. So what do you think should be the responsibilities of communal leaders in those areas? And what's going to happen if they don't do what you think they should be doing?
I mean, first of all, I want to say that the wisdom is not mine alone. I think responding to racism is a collective wisdom by people who, by 2042 or 2044, half of this country is going to be people of color. And the fastest growing group among people of color are multiracial people, and that's true for the Jewish community as well. And, we, by way of structure, the Jews of Color Initiative believes in US history, and that there are, and we understand that both race is a social construct and racism is real. And through that lens, we understand that racism is part of how the Jewish community, too, established itself over time in the United States. And there are moments in US Jewish history where the community, which has been predominated by white Ashkenazim, had opportunities presented to Jews that were only presented to those who were white. And there were moments in US history where, for example, the GI Bill is an example where Jews who were not classified as white up until a certain time in the United States. And so I also want to say that too. But there were moments in US Jewish history where there was an opportunity to kind of move into whiteness. And that movement was often in the form of an offer around a home loan or the GI Bill or a college loan that gave us the tools, right? Gave our families the tools of upward mobility, and those tools were only given to white folks. And in that moment, Jews sort of embraced at least the physics of whiteness, Ashkenazi Jews, or at least embraced the tools of whiteness. And that kind of embracing also had a cost, which was separating ourselves from people of color in the United States. And those physics of separation have clearly fomented division across people of color and white folks all over this country. We all know that because we're here and we experience it every day. In our community, we also have been, and I'm going to use this word very carefully, rather insular, partially to protect ourselves from anti-Semitism. And in creating that safety, we've also created a tremendous amount of distance and misinformation. And the same way US Jews complain, and I come from a background of community relations that nobody knows anything about Israel or the Holocaust, I would say a lot of, in the white Jewish community, very few people are steeped in the history of people of color in the United States. So we're also doing a terrible job of connecting and educating ourselves. So let me get to that answer. What our leaders need to do is understand we're sitting on top of a mountain of history that has rewarded us for being separate. And everyday Jews who have the benefit of whiteness engage in the privileges that come with people just rewarding you for looking white, right? I don't want to get into people's complex racial backgrounds, but folks who are perceived as white are rewarded every day by the tools of social mobility. It's a lubricant. And in doing that, we have also not paid attention to the natural physics that are part of US history. Every time someone says to me, tell me when Jews of color began. First of all, Jews of color began Judaism. And so if we go way, way back, Jews were not white. And in this context, we have to, first of all, help our leaders understand, why did we ever allow ourselves to think all Jews were white in the United States when the entire premise of the United States is a multiracial physics? Every community has multiracial people in it, has people of color in it. Why would the Jewish community be exempt from that? So that's the first thing, is kind of just deal with reality. The second piece is we have to discomfort ourselves with the reality that racism has been a cause of pushing Jews of color away from the community. And to sit with that reality, particularly in a context where we have been told that US Jews were super helpful in the civil rights movement, and we've always been people who've perpetuated values of social justice, of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, it's painful. It's painful to stop and think Jews have also been racist. And it's painful to dismantle the myth that has been created in some part around our role in responding to racism and own the fact that we've been racist. And I'll end by saying, as leaders, our community has been able to thrive. It has been able to extend itself. We've been able to sort of make ourselves secure. And in doing that, we've been told that, for example, people of color are more anti-Semitic than other people. We've been told that people of color are anti-Zionist, and we point to Black Lives Matter as if that's the example that makes every Black person anti-Zionist. Yep. So we've not done a lot to incentivize and to make attractive the reality that rooms should look even more diverse than this every single day in our community. And leaders have to want to grapple with giving up power. Leaders have to want to grapple with our own role in perpetuating racism. And we have to believe that being in a multiracial, anti-racist reality is actually really good for the Jews. And I'm not sure every leader believes it's good for the Jews.
Well, then I'd like to press you a little further on this very issue. Because when we say leaders, we can mean lay leaders, we can mean rabbis, and I want to ask specifically about rabbis, because I think some of the problems we might have is in that category. And let me tell you what I mean. Rabbis are often very concerned about political speech, especially pulpit rabbis, because they oversee politically mixed congregations. They don't want to piss anyone off, especially not people on their board of directors who have to vote for their renewal of their position. That's a fact we often see. So they say engaging in racial equity and social justice is inevitably political, and therefore they don't want to touch it. Ironically, many of the same rabbis have no issue whatsoever discussing and taking a clear position on Israel. Somehow, that's not political.
Right.
Everything else is. So I guess my question to you is, what would you say to a hypothetical rabbi like this who tells you this whole stuff that you just talked about? Let's say that rabbi was here and listening to your last answer. I'm not touching this stuff. I'm not going to discuss it publicly. I'm not going to debate it.
I just don't want to get in trouble with my clergy colleagues out there. So I want to just pause and say I want to be careful, because unlike being an academic in the educational environment, I'm a person.
Well, I'm tenured, so I don't have to be that careful.
That's my point, exactly. Our entire ecosystem relies on the capacity to learn and change, and for our leaders to be elastic and expansive and who they should be. And I appreciate for some rabbis, they absolutely will anchor conversations around Israel and Zionism and not touch racism or white supremacy, LGBTQIA issues. And from my perspective, none of that's good for the Jewish people. We have to, as leaders, and I would say, and again, like, I'm not a rabbi, I am a trained educator, and I know at the core of rabbinic practice is to be someone who has expansive capacity to teach and learn. And so I would say any fixed opinion about the comfort, the capacity to talk about race and racism, any opinion that's fixed is probably not in the best service of the Jewish people. And in a country that has an obsession with race and racism, and that has to figure out how to navigate the harm that's been caused by racism and systemic racism and white supremacy, I would actually say our rabbis and our clergy out there have a higher responsibility to be flexible in their thinking, to have a growth posture, and to always, always, always end a conversation with clarity about what's best for the Jews. And anytime we're talking about what's best for the Jews, and when we close our eyes, all those Jewish people are white, we have to know that's not best for the Jews.
Okay, well, I have one more question for you, and then we'll open it up. this has been fascinating so far, and I can connect to many of the things that you say. I'm trying to figure out of this, how do we move forward, given everything that you say, and where we need to move forward to, with respect to two issues that I feel you sort of have to touch them in the so-called white Jewish community if you want to get to people, in a sense. So one would be the relationship between Jews and non-Jewish people of color. And the other would be the whole issue of Israel. And if you don't touch these, you said it yourself before, people say, well, blacks, that's Black Lives Matter, that's anti-Israel, we can't talk to these people. Some people have this sort of logical framework of thinking. So how do you have to include, I feel, maybe I'm wrong, you'll tell us, but you have to include those conversations in the broader conversation of let's create this multiracial, anti-racist Jewish community. So how do you do that?
Okay, two good questions. To the first question, just to go back to the data for a second and beyond the count, on the last page of data charts, and I'm closing my eyes because I'm visualizing it in my head, there's a chart, and it's vertical, and just want to make sure I get that right, and it charts levels of connection. And at the top of the chart, you have circles, and they overlap for the most part. And what it's talking about is relationships where Jews of color feel they can be most whole and most close with others. And the space where we feel like we can be most whole and most close with others are in settings that feel like our families. And what I want to point out about that data point is our families are multiracial. There's white people in our families, there are people of color in our families, and who's of color can be very, very diverse. And so the idea is not to have just like a Jew of color space where that's the goal. The goal is to have a multiracial Jewish community, and the data tells us that we feel most comfortable in environments that are multiracial, and if they're thriving, they're probably not that racist. The space where Jews of color feel most disconnected are not with just white Jews. The spaces of disconnection are also included of the members of their same race who are not Jewish. And so the most kind of thriving space for Jews of color are Jewish multiracial spaces. And that's really important. And so, in terms of relationships with non-Jewish people of color, what I will say is we have a bias in the Jewish community that people who are not Jewish are undereducated about Judaism, and Israel. I think everybody in the United States, Jews included, are undereducated about Judaism, and Israel. And in that, we create for a lot of opportunity to create stereotypes, biases, prejudices, and reinforce them. And unless we're having dialogue with people who are different than us, then all we're doing is the natural physics are to separate us. And there's everything in this country tells us we should be separated. And so I think we collectively need to just, everybody, including non-Jews thinking about Jews, we need to just sort of give everybody a little bit of an assumption of goodwill here, and that every one of us who's raised in a US setting has been designed to be separate from others. This country thrives on people separated, and when we come together, it actually just disrupts the physics to the point where sometimes systems go haywire because people are working together. And so I wanted to say, have a lot of compassion, assume we all have a lot more to learn about each other, and we have to remember that if we approach people with some level of fear, and we haven't done something to create fear with each other, that fear is probably coming from a bias we've been taught about each other. And if we can catch ourselves feeling that bias, if we can catch ourselves feeling that trigger, we can slow ourselves down and say, oh, I feel funky. Let me not put that funk on somebody else. Okay, so let's talk about Israel for a minute. First of all, I want to say for the record that it was not the Black Lives Matter movement that created the document that specifically implicated Israel as an apartheid nation state.
Yep.
It was not the Black Lives Matter movement. It was a document created by the Movement for Black Lives. And so I just think it's really important to clear that up for anybody who's still holding on to that. I mean, here's the thing. Even when you're in Israel, I haven't been to Israel for about 4 years, and last time I was in Israel, I was in a session with a colonel from the IDFs, and I had a group of San Francisco political people with me. And we were in a session with a colonel from the IDFs, and the purpose of the session was to hear about, he teaches military ethics, and his job, wait for it, I saw you raise your eyebrows, was to decide when you shoot and kill somebody, right? And that's what he was training.
When you shouldn't?
When you should and should not shoot and kill somebody. How to evaluate the situation. And when our guests, the people who had on our trip spoke with the colonel, they asked him, can you talk a little bit about using the term occupation? And in the US Jews are very uncomfortable saying that there's an occupation happening in Israel. And the colonel looked at us like we had a little bit too much to drink. And he said, are you kidding me? What are we doing that's not occupying in Gaza, for example? Like, of course this is an occupation. Look at all of the factors. And if I was a Palestinian, I would be outraged too. And this is one colonel's opinion talking with us. But one of the things I think we need to do is give ourselves some space just to have a much more honest conversation about the multiple dynamics that are happening in Israel. And to ask ourselves when our buttons around justice are pushed and not pushed. And try to have that conversation. There's not a single one of us who's going to be able to legislate with a little L whether or not we think Israel is an apartheid state, whether or not we think what's going on in Israel is or is not an act of being colonized. Like, there's all these things around it. Every term that we use in that provocative way for the US folks is pretty uninformed. And I'm not saying that people are not informed about what's going on in Israel and Palestine. I'm saying our understanding of being colonized, our understanding of being occupied has a very US specific meaning. And a very US-centric application. And if we can sort of step back and unhinge ourselves from our US experience and say, I have questions about if this is a colonizing act. I have questions about if this does or does not count as apartheid. When I joined the JCRC staff, the Jewish Community Relations Council staff, I said, I have questions about whether or not what Israel's doing is technically apartheid. And to be able to be received and saying, let's talk about it instead of shutting down the conversation is what lets us go forward. And so I say, bring your questions around justice and equity as it relates to Israel and Palestine, but also bring your curiosities, bring your wonders, bring a deep openness to having multiple perspectives peppered at you all of the time, and have the capacity to leave with multiple perspectives versus trying to hone in on one. And if we could just deepen our skills around that, we would actually be able to have conversations about Israel, Palestine, equity, and justice. I'm interested in having a conversation. Let other people decide on whatever the answer is. I would hope as US Jews we have some capacity to actually have a conversation.
Okay, thank you. So we'll now open it up to questions from our audience, both our audience here and also at home. If you're on Zoom, please feel free to type your question in the chat, and hopefully we'll get to it. Please.
Okay, so I know that you described I know that you've been to the White House. You've also described talking to a couple of IDF colonels. So do you have like a roadmap or something of a plan to kind of bring this acceptance of that the Jews need a mixed racial community?
I don't have a roadmap or a plan. We at the Jews of Color Initiative, my role is to do just a couple of things. We focus on building out leaders who are Jewish people of color, and we do that with our grant making. We fund fellowships, we fund identity development, we fund all kinds of things that help people just grow and to establish some foundation in a communal space. We focus on research, and that research, yeah, data is absolutely a roadmap. If people were in honest and intimate relationship with data and actually used it instead of passion and personality to inform decisions, we'd be in a far better position as a U.S. Jewish community. And so, I mean, I just like, I think it's really important to, when you can do the uncomplicated thing, to do the uncomplicated thing. And we've created all this complication around accepting the fact that we're multiracial, right? Pushing back, saying, I don't see any Jews of color at synagogue, so you must not exist. What happens when the data exists and the leaders don't want to own it and use it? And so, I don't have a roadmap. I don't have a sort of magic potion. I deal in data. I deal in historical fact. And I deal in this concept, which is in fact, I need the Jewish people to thrive and to exist for at least another 5,000 years. And if we allow racism in specific to keep us apart, the US Jewish community will not stay intact, we will not thrive, and we will likely buckle under the threat of anti-Semitism and racism, which is not going to be good for the Jewish people. Appreciate your question.
Yes, please.
I'd like you to comment a little more about something you just said. Suppose you're an Ashkenazi Jew, white Jew, in a suburban synagogue, which is virtually entirely white.
Right.
And that person goes to synagogue and he looks around and he says, I think this Jews of color thing is really a solution in search of a problem.
Right.
Because when I look around, I don't see anybody who doesn't look like me. Would you comment on that and how you think is the best way to answer that sort of skepticism?
I think it's a beautiful question because for so many of our communities, they do appear all white. And for some of our synagogues, some of our day schools, some of our JCCs, we're in regions that can be predominantly white. So the first thing I want you to do, if that's what comes to you, is just to kind of pause for a second and ask yourselves, even though there are no people of color in my community, my spiritual community, I live in a country that in 20 years is going to be half people of color. And so two things around that are, first, you have every incentive to develop skills around diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice as white folks in white communities because we are a part of a multiracial nation. And one thing that we know as Jews and one thing that we know as people of color is that we share a common threat, which is white supremacy and white nationalism. So we have every incentive to be connected so that when their enemies come, that we're fighting together. And that we also recognize each other, right? Like, I want to be able to have somebody in our community look at us and say, oh, welcome, I saw you at synagogue last week. Or welcome, you don't have a Star of David around your neck, but I have the capacity to assume that you might be Jewish because I'm educated about the community. So first of all, we have a natural incentive to engage in multiracial activity and to be anti-racist because of the country we live in and that we need our neighbors as friends. Second, it's important to appreciate the reality that for many of our Jewish communities, and particularly in particular locations, they're gonna be very white. And so how do we have our leadership lead in a way that explains and talks about and models the diversity of the Jewish people so that the communities we are leading have a much more nuanced, sophisticated, honest understanding of who the Jewish community is? So that when you end up at College of Charleston and meet a Jewish person of color, you don't say, how can you be Jewish? In that way that challenges and questions one's Jewish bona fides instead of just saying, like, tell me about your Jewish experience. Tell me about, the same way I'm gonna ask you, tell me about yours. And so we have to give people the understanding that that's going to be the expectation and the reality, in contrast to what we've done for the last several hundred years, which is actually teach about the Jewish community from a place of bias, which is that Jews of color don't exist, and that the crime is in some ways a crime of omission. The last piece is this, particularly for community leaders who lead communities that reflect very white because of the geography. How do you bring in, and not just around like celebrations and holidays and what James Banks, the educator James Banks, would call the food, faces, and fiestas themes, right? Where you just want to bring in some diversity for the sake of Black History Month, for example. How do we actually diversify our liturgy? How do we diversify the different discussions of each week's parsha? How do we diversify how we're thinking about who's writing and discussing text so that we dismantle the myths of who are our community leaders, restructure it, and then when leaders come out and open up and expand that space, Jews of color come out. I asked Yaron earlier today, I said, how many Jews of color are there on campus? The ones who don't come to the Jewish community. And so I'll end by saying we have to assume, instead of assuming all Jews look a certain way, I want us to restructure ourselves to assume anybody you bump into could be Jewish. Let them tell you they're not. But how would it change your interaction if every time you bumped into a person, you assumed they were part of your tribe? Instead of creating those filters of distance, I'll tell you what, some of those people you assume are Jewish are gonna tell you they're Jewish. And then the synagogue won't look so white, not because of its geography, but because it's more welcoming and more inclusive and less racist. Not a single community that you all are in has no Jews of color. They're just not coming to your environments because of racism.
Okay, yes.
That's a difficult thing for some people to hear. Sure. I am our local I work with our local community relations council, and I've had the pleasure of being on a couple of calls, I think, that you spoke at with JCPA. I was going to ask a very similar question because coming to this talk tonight, I mentioned to a couple of people who I was going to see, and they said the same thing, that, well, there aren't really Jews of color in Charleston. And I responded that I think that was not the case, and that, that we need to get better at being more welcoming spaces and places for Jews of color. I guess my question, since you answered my question his question, is how can we go about? What are some tangible steps that we can take to make our spaces more welcoming for Jews of color? And do you know of any? I know you said that there's not a plan that you have for us, but are there a couple of communities that you would point to that have done a really good job of this, of kind of flipping the script and going from a very white-centric Jewish community experience to a much more multiracial Jewish community? And if so, are there some of those communities in the South? Have you seen a couple of those? Have you seen some communities in the South that have done a really good job at this?
I love your questions. And first I want to say, I was on a Jewish communal call for the state of Hawaii. And after the sort of discussion about the data and all of that, a white presenting community member was like, had a question, and the whole question was like it was a little gruff, and the premise was that there were no Jews of color. And it was wild because on the Zoom, in the chat, all these people started chiming in. Like, you don't know my family structure. Like, I have 2 kids of color at home. Like, my wife is... And so I think, when we actually... And it might be an uncomfortable push of the door opening, Jews of color come out. Like, we are everywhere. And I think that's a really important piece to sort of hold, which is Jews of color are everywhere and they're not in our community. And to your point, and we wonder why, right? Like, what's getting in the way? So first of all, I think create opportunities, and hopefully they won't be too testy, but to get the community to sort of come out as our multiracial selves. The data tells us that 1 in 5 families in the United States, 1 in 5 Jewish families self-identify as multiracial, meaning that there are people of color in our families, and we operate in the world through a lens which says, is this environment going to be safe for my family member of color? And on the coast, those numbers are 1 in 4. And so those numbers are huge. And so the next piece, I think, for you is to think about and I was at dinner, we were meeting and just talking about some of these things, and I said, okay, for the Jews of Color Initiative, I think our closest grantee is in Raleigh. And I'm just pointing up in that way. But when we made our grant in Raleigh, it was literally around a couple of Jewish communal leaders who were community relations folks, who Jews of color, who received a grant specifically to go find other Jews of color. Just to go find community and then figure out how to build community. What do Jews of color need? And, they just sort of set out on foot and spent a year just looking for each other, building connections, getting word out, and seeing if there was a need there. So I think in this community, the wonder is, and there will be, they might be right here in this room right now, and we don't know, but there will be your bridge people, right? Like people who are engaged in Jewish communal life, who care about it, and who, despite the headwinds of racism, were in it. And you need to find your bridge people, and you need to be careful, and I mean that in with an ethos of care, not careful, but you need to hold these colleagues with an ethos of care because they're giving a lot. They probably receive a lot of racism in their experience, but they're still here. And we need to invest in them, and we need to do that in really institutional ways. We want to support them with their leadership, and then we want to say, we know you care about the community. What are your ideas? Not what's the magic, thing, but just what are your ideas? What would you want to do if you were going to build networks and build community? And just start there. And let the little seeds that are being planted take root. It takes time. And during that time, you're building trust. And you're building credibility. And you're doing that by making sure you're educated, your community around you is diversity, inclusion, equity, justice, trained. All these things you can do while the seeds are sowing, right? And then as your leaders are getting developed and then you figure out how you can support them in doing what they want to do, a network is building around you. The trust is being built around you and your credibility, and that's a lot of infrastructure to work with. And then from there, you sort of say, who of you, not we want you all to be on our committee, right? We don't want to tokenize people, but who of you might want to do this for a little bit of a part-time gig or for a job? Not we want you to volunteer. We don't want you to carry more water. But who can we really honor by saying we want to support people? And I would say the one community I would point to is Baltimore. And just because it's nearby and we have colleagues in the room who have, but we have been working in Baltimore over the last couple of years. The community has cultivated leaders. The community has built relationships with their equivalent of the Federation, which is stunning in all the best ways. And it's very, very JOC anchored. In that particular community, it's very Black centered, and that's right on. It's really right on, but that's what's happened over the last couple of years, and other people in this room can talk about it more. Thank you, right on.
Thank you. Yes, let's get some questions from this part of the room.
She had her hand up the whole time. Everybody, take your time.
I definitely am one of the undereducated people that you mentioned, and I may add a little bit of complexity to the sort of theme of intersectionality that you have going on with race in your religious community. And I was wondering if we look at the United States as the population and then the Jewish community as almost a sample, in what ways do things like disparities between opportunities that men and women have differ from overarching America? How is it unique in the Jewish community? And I'm not sure if it is, it's just.
So I am not expert on that, and I would say Ilana Ween, my colleague at Safety, Respect, Equity Network, would be the place I would go for that question. Here's what I would say. In our data, and again, it's not representative, but in our data, women, folks who self-identify as women are overrepresented, and I think the number was something like 67% of our respondents self-identify as women, 9% self-respond as gender non-binary. And so I think that, again, it's not my expert, and I don't want to speak out of my lane, but what I will say is in our particular data, women are those who self-identify as women are overrepresented. They also overrepresent in terms of formal education. They overrepresent in terms of community engagement. And again, our data isn't representative, and so I want to be really careful with that.
Specifically for people of color?
Yeah. Yeah. It was around gender and the disparities for men and women in the data set.
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. My name is Jamie. I am the assistant director here at CFC Hillel and also our engagement professional on staff. And at the end of this year, I will be going to rabbinical school. Nice. Thank you. So a couple different things. Like one, as an engagement person on campus, I think a lot about who's not in the room and who we're leaving out, and consciously like who we can go out and find. And I was wondering if there are ways that are not tokenizy to go and try and find Jews of color and welcome them into our space, and how we can prepare ourselves for when they get here so that they have a positive experience upon arrival. And then also, as I prepare to move into a rabbinical role and go into that training, I'm headed to HUC, Hebrew Union College, the Reform Seminary. They love to say that they're big on tikkun olam and social justice and all of these things, but I find that the Reform movement can, as all institutions can, fall behind in racial equity training. So as a future rabbi, what education should I seek out, maybe in addition to my formal education, to make sure that when I become a leader of the Jewish community, I'm prepared to speak up or give up power or make space for Jews of color that I'll be leading?
Right on. First question I would say, I think it's really important to assume that Jews of color have been in your space and they didn't stay. Or maybe they did and you didn't know it. And so I would be curious, like, for you to sort of muse about who's been in all, and let's expand it to say just like the college's Jewish formal community container, if you will. I think it's really important to sort of have a reflection moment with anybody who has historical memory, just to sort of wonder, like, I'm sure Jews of color have been in our space. Do we remember what happened? Did they give us any feedback? What are our learnings? And if we don't have those recollections, to say we probably missed some people, right? Just in general, I would make that assumption. And every university I've been to, in spaces where Jews who are in leadership roles assume there are no Jews of color, there are always Jews of color. And so I think we just need to make that assumption. And in this case, I would say, and you have to remember, like, first of all, you're on a college campus, so you're dealing with identity politics all the time. You have age and stage stuff going on in terms of just where folks are at developmentally. And you also have the burden and the blessing of being connected to the traditional Jewish community into Hillel. And for those who are undereducated, they might make a very fast leap up the ladder of inference to Israel, for example, and object based on their assumptions and perspectives on what they think about Jews in Israel, right? All kinds of things are going on that are headwinds in general for the work that you're courageously doing, and thank you. So I would say get out of here and go out there to where people of color are. And to find your peer leaders in those spaces who you can get into relationship with and get into proximate partnership with, and just sort of say, like, how do we collaborate? Do you have Jews in your communal space who don't come to our space? And every college campus I've been on, even in various regions around the country, there are always Jews of color in the spaces where there are people of color, because that's where we're often safest. And then I would also say, meet your community where it is. And so I know, like, I have hopes, I have dreams for everything that I do, and then I walk into a space and then we calibrate to our context. And so how do you take all that research you're doing and all that networking and outreaching that you're doing, and then the young people who show up are who you are in service to, right? And so you just say to them, like, you know, if they're not JOC, say, like, you know, who do we want to be in community with, and how do we go out there or bring them in? And then be super authentically excited about who naturally comes. And don't be hard on yourself if only one JOC or no JOC or whatever shows up. It takes time, in the same way our colleague over here from the community relations who's sowing those seeds. You have to sow seeds, and you have a lot of headwinds against you just because of age and stage and identity and all the things happening in this environment. And really, like, most of the time it's kids, it's college students' parents who want them here in the Jewish communal space. It's not always coming from the student themselves. And so I just want to encourage you to meet them where they are, do all the things, put in all the efforts, and always meet them where they are, physically and spiritually in this context. And then quickly with your other question, here's what I would say. At this time, really not one of our rabbinic institutions of education is set up to give you a diverse education. It's just not. And so I would say, like, find out what Reb Evan Trailer's reading and studying, and learn from Evan. Reach out and look at Rabbi Angela Wuchtal's lists and study what she's studying, and then go beyond that. Move out of your denominational space and read what Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein in the Orthodox community is musing on, or what music he's playing those days. Rabbi Shea Rishon, African-American Orthodox ordained. Rabbi Sandra Lawson in the Reconstructionist movement. But you need to, like, really, really appreciate that they have blazed this trail for everybody else, and they've left behind not even breadcrumbs, but like book lists, right? And text lists, and they did it for you. And they did it so that your community doesn't have to experience what we all experience, which is not even having a clergy of color in front of us, not even like a piece of text for so many decades. You don't get to make those same mistakes, but you have all these other people who have supported all this work in the last bunches of decades, who've done it for you. And so use it, learn from it, and then pay it forward.
Great. Thank you so much.
Right on. Thank you.
This is great. I have one question that was texted to me, and it's related to what you said about different denominations just a few seconds ago. And it's more of the informative type of question, because I just wonder, we talked so much about Jews of color, and maybe we can make this definition a little bit more precise in two ways. One, if you can talk about denominational identity of Jews of color, like what do we know about where are they? And a little bit more perhaps on, do we differentiate within that general group between, let's say, Black Jews, Latino Jews, Mizrahi or Sephardi Jews? I mean, clearly there's some differences in the experiences, and so how do you see all of those types of differences?
So in terms of the denominational differences, we specifically and intentionally did not ask about denominational identity in our study. And we did that because, first of all, like, we are not in the business of dividing Jews in that way. And really the Reform movement, the conservative movement, the Orthodox movement, they should be getting their own data. And if they actually did their own research and got their own data, the cascading effect would be super positive and super profound for the community.
Do they care enough?
No, not yet.
Okay.
And they are often disaggregated systems, and so collecting that data is very cumbersome, but really they should. Having said that, again, in our data set, and it's not a truly representative sample, but the Jews of color who responded, I would say many self-identified as observant or highly traditionally engaged. Many talk about and demonstrate strong relationships with text and study. And so I would say many are observant with a little o, and I don't mean that in an Orthodox way. I mean observant of Jewish engagement, Jewish identity, Jewish life. Highly, highly engaged, and it includes ritual training and text training, which tells us that they're religiously engaged and not just culturally engaged.
Yeah.
To the second question. In our study, the majority of participants self-identified as multiracial and identified as having 2 or 3 different racial backgrounds. And so again, we see that as a parallel structure in the United States. And in real life, we know that Jews of color experience racism the same way non-Jewish people of color experience racism in the US community. And so there's a bias that can be targeted against people who present as Black or brown. and the dangers that Black and brown Jews, and I would also say Asian women, for example, and what we've seen happen in Atlanta, all the anti-Asian hate crimes that have happened in the last couple of years. I would say there's both a sophisticated understanding, particularly around younger people, and what I mean by, like, I'm an older person, I'm gonna be 50 next month, and so, you know, I live in a world that can be very binary. And I was also raised in a context where there was not the capacity, I think, societally to understand that people of color can calibrate our relationships with each other on a dynamic basis. And so I'll just share, when I was at Brown University talking with the students, the Jewish students of Brown University, I was in a room with Black Jews, Asian Jews, Latinx Jews, and I was just like, kind of tell me about how you all roll together. And, you know, the Asian sister said, well, you know, when there's a Black and brown, you know, anti-Black and brown hate going on campus, the Asian students rally, like Asian students for Black lives. And then the Black students were like, but when there's anti-Asian hate, we rally. It's, you know, Black Jews against Asian hate. And so I think what we see is the capacity to be in dynamic relationship with shutting down hate and appreciating without the spirit of competition that the way racism impacts me, the way it impacts you, the way it impacts somebody else, it might be different, but there's room for all of it, and then there's room for all of us to be in relationship because of it. I think we've created this myth that somehow like there's a competition between the racial differences. It's not a competition, it's a set of different experiences, and we have the capacity to understand complex, different experiences, even though when we do that, it creates nuance. Nuance creates understanding, and understanding creates relationship. And the biggest threat to white supremacy, to anti-Semitism, is us being in relationship with each other.
Okay, thank you. Please.
All right. So in a sense, you kind of answered the question I was about to ask, but it was a beautiful answer. So thank you for that. So I wanted to talk about this generational difference, because as an educator here, I work with 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, and I'm always struck at how already normalized thinking about differences among the students I teach. And I think it happens in so many different ways. I think students are coming from more urban settings. They've already been exposed to messages about embracing differences and so forth. But I think Jews of color who are celebrities are doing a lot of legwork thinking about, I have a student who's winning an award, I don't know if I should be giving this away, but for her paper on the radical Black Jewish femininity of Tiffany Haddish's Black Mitzvah, that's great. Thinking about Drake, we did a great class on Hanukkah with David Diggs's new song. So, in a sense, it's normalized for this generation, and I think that's fantastic. And so I'm wondering if you saw this in your study, because I know you primarily looked at younger folks when you interviewed them, if this gives you some hope, if this is kind of the reaction you're having to this as well. But then the flip side of this is I do find that the education that students bring primarily from Jewish day schools doesn't necessarily grapple with the really complicated history. I teach a class on Jews in the Atlantic slave trade, and we do a lot of processing. And so, there's this disconnect that I also see. And so I'm just curious what you found in terms of generation, how you're thinking about younger Jews living in urban settings, coming with these different experiences and so forth.
It's such an interesting question. I'm of a couple of minds. I mean, one is I feel mostly so relieved. I grew up in a Jewish communal setting where there were 5 non-white Jews in a community of 2,000. And I don't know if I want to say I was deprived of a resonant experience, But my experience would have left me much more whole if I knew there were other people like me. And if I had also had the capacity to be in relationship around complex ideas like racism. And I think we've done a tremendous disservice to many generations of Jews by not just dealing in reality. And that includes talking about anti-Semitism. I mean, one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we've gotten from young Jews in the last 5 years is they were not prepared for the kind of hate that was unleashed in this country over the last 5 years. We did that by being like, it's all bagels and, you know, whatever. It's not. Like, we are a people who have run from violence, who have run from genocide, and we will continue to run. And we are always going to live on a planet where there is anti-Semitism. And so we need to deal in reality in general. And I'm so happy that young people are engaged in a conversation around race and racism, because it makes talking about reality much easier. It also means we have to equip them with the skills to be in relationship, not to just know about it and talk about the horrible things, but to build the connective pieces that actually bring people in community together. Like, we also need to be dealing in community and not in isolation. And I think the last piece around it is we have to also have the capacity to step out of the way as our young people emerge with all of these skills, all of these tools, and hopefully the power we give them to activate those skills and tools. We have to move out of the way. We are very protective as Jewish leaders of the community we've created for good reason, because people have tried to hunt and kill us. And it's our responsibility to ensure that we perpetuate. And sometimes the way we create that tool of safety is to push out others, or again, to insulate us in. And the cost is it brings us out of relationship with people. What young people have done is brought us back into relationship with each other. We need to keep them safe while they do that. And we need to understand that they're actually making the road that we will need to walk in the future. It's not the other way around. We're not making the road for them.
Thank you very much. This has been fascinating. Our time is up. The downside of all of you on Zoom is that you can't stay here in the room and ask our guest more questions once we are done. That's why it's a good idea to come to these events in person. And we encourage all of you who are listening to us now to do that in the future. And all of you who are here, please continue to show up. So thank you very much. This has been a real pleasure having you here. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you in future and near future Jewish Studies events. Thank you.